Good afternoon, everyone. This is our quarterly Elected Officials Transportation Committee meeting. Welcome. So we've got elected officials from Pitkin County, town of Snowmass Village, and city of Aspen. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
We're going to start off with do we do a review first, or we usually do public comment first?
Usually do the review first, then public comment, Mr. Chair.
Really?
It's up to you. It's your meeting.
I'd rather do public comment first.
Okay.
So public comment, anybody wishing to make a public comment, please come forward, state your name, and we'll give you about 3 minutes.
Can I sit here?
Yeah, please.
My name is Adriana Lisman, and I have lived at Highlands Maroon Creek Station 5 for almost 14 years. And we are suffering under the popularity of the Maroon Bells. I'm on the 3rd floor facing Buttermilk and the buses, and I can't even sit out my balcony in the summer because I get sick in no time from the fumes. I keep my windows closed due to the fumes, and we breathe the pollution, we see the nonstop idling, and we hear the explosive noises from the buses while they drive up, and they go up to ramp 2, and this starts at 7 a.m. and ends at 2:20 a.m. in the morning. And many families live at the Highlands, and dozens of children are exposed to fumes too. Traffic has become a serious problem. People have been driving on the wrong side of the street to avoid the traffic jams. And it's a miracle we haven't seen a fatality. And I would like you to consider the following. 1, no idling. We see it, we breathe it, and there's a city ordinance in place. 2, only clean buses to be sent to the bells, and not the old junkers, which are polluting our paradise and polluting the bells. And 3 would be reroute cars when parking lot is full to Buttermilk or to the intercept lot. Stage Maroon Bells visit through those locations. Prevent traffic jams and potential fatalities. And I thank you for considering implementing these sensible and practical solutions.
Great, thank you. There's several of us that serve on the RAFTA board, and this is probably a conversation will bring forward to RAFTA, since RAFTA runs those buses.
All right, thank you for
thank you very much.
doing it.
Yeah, Adriana, thank you for putting it on our radar. It's part of this suffering under the crush of our own popularity and having to do with 250,000 visitors up at the Maroon Bells. And I think it's something we have to consider, George, just like we talked about with Hanging Lake, you know, the change in parking and transit over there. So, Adriana, we'll put it on the RAFTA agenda.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rachel?
You know, just to add on to that, you think about it, the bus program to Maroon Bells was instigated to save the Maroon Bells in that wilderness area from the air pollution effects and the traffic jams. And so now that if it's backing up to the departure point, I really appreciate you bringing it forward because we'll have to look for new answers there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have a comment, Art?
I just wanted to say thanks for your, what I consider very clear, concise comments.
I appreciate it.
I do too.
Anybody else wish to make a public comment at this time? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public comment and go back to the agenda, John. So we're looking at review of decisions reached at our last meeting, January 19th.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mostly that last meeting was about the Upper Valley Mobility Study, and it will be on the agenda tonight. The October meeting was on the potential technology solutions and kind of a kickoff meeting. The January meeting had a review of the rider forecast, current bus operations, and discussions of the BRT and LRT alignment. And tonight you'll see a discussion on the ridership forecast for both alternatives, LRT and BRT, capital and operations and maintenance costs for both of these alternatives, and the Parsons team will be up here shortly to do that.
Okay, any questions for John on that? Okay.
I always put up the budget. Tom Oken isn't here. He's the expert on this, but the only thing I can pass on to you is that the half-cent sales tax revenues are up. I don't know how much, but they are up, and that will help the fund out. If you have any questions, I can try to answer those. And next up is will be the. Oh, I'm sorry, George. I'm running your meeting. Go ahead.
Well, that's all right. I'll be happy to switch places, actually. Were there any questions on the quick budget that we may not be able to answer this time? Okay. John, I thought next was
Oh, we have the.
the
You're right.
confirmation of the 2017 meeting dates.
Yes, that's correct. That's always my most important piece of the agenda. The next meeting is June 15th, and want to see if that's still good. And then after that, October 19th, back here in this room. Are those still good meeting dates for everyone?
And I'm going to suggest that since Parsons' study will be done, we'll have the sort of the wrap up on at our June 15th meeting. That and the October meeting is typically taken up with budget. That we may want to try to have a meeting in between the June and October to really digest what we'll hear from Parsons' completed study and see where we're going to go from there. So that's just an idea to throw out there, maybe in August or September.
Okay.
Does that sound reasonable?
But I guess I want to hear see where we are in Parsons by the end of the meeting before that, but I'm open to having another meeting if needed, for sure.
I think they'll be pretty close to done on the UVMS on this piece by the June meeting.
That's correct.
That's
Right.
what their schedule is showing.
So then it would just be an opportunity for us to really digest that information, revisit it, and see where we want to take that information down the line. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you, George. I really appreciate that suggestion because given that the October meeting is really the budget meeting, past the budget for the next year, I think some more advanced planning of what that budget will look like is going to be needed by us, and so it seems to be a pretty big gap between June and October where we all will need to talk about the direction forward and the larger plan.
Right.
Thank
So maybe, John, we could do sort of a Google Calendar, a monkey calendar for August or September, throw some dates out and see where people's schedules are and vacations and things like that.
Anybody have any thoughts for August versus September? Just off the top? Okay. We'll float some dates around, and
Yeah, maybe September after the summer.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. All right, great.
Okay.
Good?
Usually it's the third Thursday of September, if you want to try and narrow it down. The second is the RAFTA board meeting. So that's something for everybody to think about.
Okay, thanks. Anything else for you, John?
No, sir.
All right, so we're going to sort of roll into the main event here. This is going to be the Upper Valley Mobility Study update, and Ralph is going to lead this. This is going to be a fairly intensive, data-driven presentation, and I think Ralph has told me that he'll have this in segments, and it may be best that if we hold our questions to the end of each segment to sort of keep this rolling along, if that works. So if you have any questions, just kind of jot them down, and we'll have different breaks between this presentation to ask and clarify and any of the presentations.
Yeah, I don't know if you know everybody, Ralph Trapani, Phil Hoffman, and Jen. Are you still here? There you are over here, all from the Parsons team. They've been doing a great job.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that introduction. It's a complicated set of slides we've got tonight, and what we're going to do is talk about really three broad categories. One would be potential bus reductions at Ruby Park. Another would be the ridership forecasting. The third item is capital cost and O&M, and I know you're all interested in that. Then we'll talk about just a quick summary comparison of the two options and then our next steps. But at this point, I'd like to turn this over to Phil Hoffman, one of our senior transit planners with Parsons, and he's going to talk about the bus reductions at Ruby Park.
Good evening. Good to see you all again. What we'd like to do is... Sorry?
Push the button. There you go.
What we'd like to do is, as Ralph said, just talk a little bit about what this study really started to be in the first place, and that was to consider ways that we could reduce the number of buses at Ruby Park, and not only consider the number of buses and how those could be reduced potentially, but also to improve the quality of the bus service, specifically in terms of noise and emissions at Ruby Park. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. You may recall that the corridor that we're looking at is between Brush Creek and Ruby Park, just over 6 miles. And we had identified 6 routes that potentially could be intercepted and passengers transferred to either bus rapid transit or to light rail. The idea being, again, to reduce the number of trips. A key element of this, the next slide, a key element of this is to consider implementation of the modified direct alignment across the remote easement. The idea being to shorten the distance a bit, to make the trip time a little bit shorter, a little bit faster for the buses, for example, obviously improve traffic flow as well, all of the other potential benefits that you all have been studying for quite a while in this alignment. When it came down to the actual number of buses, you may recall that, again, looking at these 6 routes, we identified how many bus trips per day are being made using these routes and carrying people from Down Valley, Glenwood Springs, Snowmass, Buttermilk, etc., to Ruby Park and back. So the total number of bus trips per day is 458. Now, we started looking at that in terms of hourly breakdown and hourly trips, and that's what's reflected in this next slide. As you can see, over the course of the day, from 5 a.m. in the morning until 2 a.m. in the morning, the following morning, obviously, you see a pretty high level of bus service throughout the day. A little bit higher in the peaks, the morning peak and the afternoon peak. And what this translates to, for example, in the afternoon peak between 4 and 5 p.m., is 17 buses in and 17 buses out of Ruby Park. Now, you may remember that at the very beginning of this, there was a perception that there are thousands of buses in Ruby Park, and we've got to do something about that. We've got to reduce that number. When you start looking at the numbers and breaking them down, again, it's bus trips, and again, they're buses in and buses out. So you see that it's a slightly different notion than thousands of buses. I mean, RAFTA only operates 93 buses, so obviously it'd be a little tough to get to thousands. But when you look at it in terms of the bus trips, you see how this breaks out on an hourly basis over the course of the day. Now, corresponding to that bus service level, I should say, is the actual passenger loading that we're seeing. Again, just on these 6 buses, there are 6 bus routes. Those 6 routes, by the way, are carrying about half of all of RAFTA's ridership in a typical day. And this is how it breaks out over the course of the day. As you'd expect, the up valley into Aspen, that's in the blue, has the higher peak in the morning, corresponding peak in the afternoon going down valley out of Aspen. And these are how the numbers break out. Now, you notice that there is a little bit of a dip in the middle of the day. And yet, if you remember the previous slide, in fact, you can flip to that if you don't mind. Oops.
Sorry, wrong way. There we go.
You see how that level of service is maintained pretty much across all of those midday hours. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, gee, if we don't have as much demand for the service, could we reduce that level of service? Maybe yes, maybe no, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But RAFTA has been remarkable in responding to the demand by all of the various constituencies here and trying to maximize that level of service. So whether it makes sense to try and reduce that or not, I'm not sure. We'll delay that to a discussion a little bit later. But the point is, again, this is the kind of passenger loading we're seeing on an hourly basis. And so the idea was to see what could we do to respond to that in terms of a reasonable service level, or say a minimum service level with bus rapid transit or light rail to intercept those trips. I apologize for the complexity of this table. There's a lot going on here, but let me just cut right through it real quick. If you look at the first column, the average headway of those 6 routes, all of the buses coming in and out, it's about 2 to 3 minutes between buses, basically, that you'd see a bus in or out of Ruby Park. It translates to those 458 trips per day. The vehicles range from a 40-passenger Gillig to a 57-passenger MCI, the ones running up and down Valley, for example. The daily seat capacity, in other words, the number of buses times the number of seats on the buses times the number of trips, gives you that large number of daily seat capacity. You could carry as many as 20,000, a little over 20,000 passengers per day. The current ridership is about 6,800. So in other words, we're not filling the buses necessarily, but we are maintaining a very high level of service. Now, we're going to talk in a few minutes about the projected ridership forecasts, but what we started to look at was just from a capacity standpoint, what would be the minimum amount of BRT or light rail service that we'd need to provide enough service to, or enough seats to serve the existing passenger loads. So if you look at the middle column where it says BRT, we looked at a scenario where we might have 10-minute service, bus every 10 minutes, literally, 6 buses an hour. We'd cut that number of trips down to 224 per day, just from a pure capacity standpoint. We'd be talking perhaps 60-foot articulated buses. You see the daily seat capacity there, 13,888. Even if we saw a doubling of ridership over the next, say, 20 years, that 10-minute BRT service at a minimum service level would provide enough capacity. So stick with me now. On the third column, if we look at light rail, obviously we're talking about, for example, 2-car trains that can carry even more passengers. From a purely capacity demand standpoint, we think that 15-minute headway service on light rail, transferring those passengers from the existing 6 bus routes, would be sufficient. That would take about 144 train trips a day, quite a bit less than the 458 you've got today. Again, look at the capacity, the daily seat capacity for train. It's, of course, even more than BRT. We're talking about 2-car trains. So it's a lot of capacity, and again, more than enough that would be needed, even if the current ridership doubled. Okay, so that's kind of where that sits. But I want to emphasize, this is an absolute minimum service plan. It would be providing not anywhere near the level of service that you have today. And so a fair number...
You mean in terms of headways?
Correct. A number of bus trips in and out. And so, for example, if somebody said, well, I'm used to waiting 5 minutes or 10 minutes for a bus, and now you're telling me I've got to wait 15 or 20 minutes for a train, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to drive. Well, then we've got a problem, because we obviously don't want to increase traffic levels any more than we have. So we did this analysis just to show, again, what would the minimum service level translate into, and what does that represent in terms of cost of BRT or light rail, and Ralph's going to be speaking to that in just a few minutes. So we'll come back to this idea of being able to consider a more refined service plan, maybe not quite as high a service level as you have today, but maybe something a little bit less that would still provide a high level of service, but maybe reduce that number of buses a little bit. Again, the whole point of this study. Let's go ahead to the next. So this is graphically, we had shown you this before, I believe, just graphically illustrates what I'm talking about here. The existing number of buses in and out, the 458 per day, if you replace those with a light rail system at a minimum service level, and you had 144 train trips a day, that's what that would look like. If you went with BRT, again, just from a capacity standpoint, you need 224 bus trips a day. So again, the issue is going to be to next analyze a refined bus service plan that could still maintain a good high level of service, but potentially reduce the number of buses. Now let's say for a minute that, we just need this high level of service. We don't want anybody getting back in their car. We want to keep people on transit. It's been getting better every year with the service that RAFT has been providing. Let's not even reduce that service level. What else could we do to at least improve the quality of the bus trips in and out of Aspen. And that's where the idea is to consider the use of electric buses. I think we might have mentioned this at the very first meeting back in October when we talked about some of the different technologies. And it's remarkable how far electric buses, electric trains have come over the last even 5 years. There are a lot of opportunities available to replace at least some of the current RAFTA fleet and City of Aspen fleet with electric buses that are viable and can run throughout the day. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Questions on this segment?
Are we done with this first segment?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. I have one question then, to Steve. You started this presentation with the sort of the misnomer that there's thousands of buses coming in and out of Aspen each day. The numbers you're presenting here, 17 buses in and 17 buses out, that's really just the commuter buses. It doesn't take into account in the winter the ski buses as well as the City of Aspen local route buses?
Yeah, this does not include the local buses because we wouldn't be able to intercept them from Brush Creek. In other words, we were focused on that corridor and how light rail, for example, might be operated between Brush Creek and Ruby Park to intercept those routes. So it does include buttermilk ski. It includes the Snowmass Aspen buses and the Snowmass ski buses, as well as all of the down valley.
Oh, it does, okay.
So it does include all the commuters, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Steve?
Looking at your numbers with a theoretical keeping a 5-minute headway on the light rail or the BRT, you could triple the number of around 40,000 passengers on the light rail per hour. You could do about 27,000 per hour on the BRT, which if we're trying to reduce the automobile traffic into Aspen, that could be a good goal to strive for. So maybe trying to maintain a 5-minute headway coming in during, at least during the peak times, I think could be a good goal that could increase the ridership tremendously.
You bet. Absolutely.
Rachel?
If we could go back to that one chart that had the ridership potentials, there you go. I guess what I'm wondering, you had stated, I believe, that light rail could cover double the passengers it does now with that type of system. So although current ridership is 6,800, they could easily expand to the 13.6. Can BRT do that with the current number of buses as well? You know, that's what I'm kind of wondering. Comparing the service frequency levels and the bus trips, if you still have your peak demand, say at 5 o'clock, would you still be able to move that doubling of passengers in the future at 5 o'clock with the same number of buses, 17 in and 17 out?
Short answer is yes.
Okay.
And the reason being is that there's still enough capacity, think of it as unused capacity, that could still be filled up.
Okay.
So
we kind of hear from people that they are getting on buses at standing room only at 5 o'clock and 5:30.
Sure. Well, and the next step of this will be to analyze, given the expected future demand or future growth in ridership, what kind of service level might be required. No doubt there would be some routes that would likely need some additional buses,
Okay.
but I can't imagine that it would be a gigantic number. In other words, it wouldn't be like a doubling of the buses just to accommodate that growth.
Yeah, and I'm not doubting it. I'm glad we're doing a fresh set of eyes and look at it, so I appreciate the in-depth explanation. I'm just trying to think back to, and Ralph, maybe you recall, it wasn't that long ago that we had to do a review of the record of decision to see if it was still valid, and and I seem to recall it having this really huge number of buses that would be needed in the future to maintain the traffic goal of the City of Aspen and the standards required in the record of decision. Are you comparing your work now to that update of the record of decision, that its projections?
Well, the work that Parsons did was on some cost estimating, and we have used that. But Rachel, I'm not recalling the numbers that you're talking about on the other side of it. That study, by the way, was 10 years ago, I believe.
Yeah, it may have been. Again, I just kind of wondering if any of this transit work that we have done over the past 20, 23 years, how well things track with projections of the past. So kind of like I asked before, when that record of decision came out, there was a number for potential population growth in the valley. And I heard a lot of people at the time say, oh, we'll never go to those numbers. That'll never happen. But, you know, in the 16 years, it seems like it came true. So that's the only reason I'm kind of looking back to say, was there validation from some of these previous reports, or were they wildly high, or you know, that sort of thing, so that we can see how they match up. Thank you.
Other questions for Phil at this point? Adam, then Bert.
You're saying that there's a possibility of Sorry, Boyd. There's a possibility of doubling the ridership with the same amount of buses, plus or minus?
Yes.
So the average bus is less than 50%?
Well, again, it varies by route, it varies by run, it varies by hour of the day. So there are a lot of variables in there.
I appreciate. I mean, I'm assuming
just in general.
the 10:30 bus, and you need to run regular buses.
Mm-hmm.
The 10:30 bus is going to have a lot less people, a lot fewer people, than the bus at 4:30.
Right.
I see Dan Blankenship may have a very quick, brief answer to this question.
Only take me 10 minutes.
You've got about 1 minute.
You know, we have a directional service, so at peak times the buses are pretty full coming into town, BRTs, valley buses, relatively empty going out. At the same time in the morning, we have, and when you look at Phil's charts, it's not intuitive. I think you have to drill down a little bit further. In the morning, we have all the skier shuttles going to Buttermilk and to Snowmass, and those are relatively full, but they're coming back relatively lightly loaded. So I would say in the peak direction, in the peak hours, we don't have a lot of capacity. But the rest of the day, we do have a lot of capacity, and that's where a lot of these empty seats can be found. If we could spread the demand more evenly over the course of the day, we could take advantage of all that capacity. But unfortunately, most people want to ride during the peak times, and we're already pretty thinly stretched then.
Well, and I think that backs up to what Rachel's saying. We're never going to get equality on direction or on time of day. So if we're going to be doubling something, which I have some more questions about, ridership, I'm not sure how we have roughly the same amount of buses. We're not, unless we're going to start taking away bus service between 10 and 12 and 1 and 4, which I'm assuming we're not. We're always going to have a lot of empty seats for 2/3 of the day, and we're always going to have an over demand for 1/3 of the day during the peak times. So how do you not add more buses? Some people will leave a little early, and just like they drive a little bit early or late, and the same thing with the bus ridership. But how do we not need more equipment with more ridership for the times of the day when they're peaked? I'm not
Yeah, and in fact, you will.
Okay.
Dan's explaining it exactly right. I mean,
No, Dan's explained it right, but I think the comment, and maybe I misheard you a couple minutes ago, was we really don't need that many more, and I'm paraphrasing you, and I'm probably wrong, we really don't need that many more buses, even if we double, and I'm not sure how that...
Well, yeah, because I had used
apologies.
the word bus trips and the peak hour as an example. Are we really going to still be able to move double the riders' needs at that time period if it's double the population, 17 buses in, 17 out? Well, it's still... Actually,
Right,
doesn't seem to add up.
right, and that answer is no. No, the peak periods always are going to demand more. There's no doubt. Now, by the way, that example of the doubling was only an example. We're going to talk in a minute about what we think the ridership will be
Okay,
growing
I'll
to.
hold off to then.
So-
Thank you. Thank you, Ralph.
I will.
Bert?
Thanks.
The 33% load factor that you mentioned, you explained was a variety of things. One, because of the time of day, and two, because of the inbound and direction of service. Are we doing everything we can to optimize that? And are there lessons to be learned from other services globally that have the same issues where people come in to work one direction and don't? How do we compare to the rest of the world?
You know, you compare quite well, and it's a very common problem everywhere, not only in the United States, but as you say, pretty much all over the world. But it seems from what we've observed from RAFTA's operations, Dan and his staff are constantly making adjustments to respond to whatever that demand is. Is it a perfect world? No. Will it ever be? No, absolutely not. Will light rail fix everything? No, definitely not. You're always going to have peaks. There will be some spreading of the peaks, as Dan mentioned, but it's never going to be in parity. You're never going to find that perfect opportunity. It just doesn't exist.
Thank you.
Other questions from this side of the table? Good for right now? Okay.
So the next thing we wanted to talk about is this notion of ridership forecasts. About the forecast, we just wanted to mention that we think that these are reasonable at this point based on the resources and information that we have available. This is a spreadsheet-driven tool. It's not a black box model that you may have heard about in the past. For an environment like this, you've got a pretty complex situation here. It's not just one Denver metropolitan area, for example, that has the Denver Regional Council of Governments model, which is plenty complicated. You've got all sorts of things going on here. So what we were tasked to do was to put together this spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet model, that could at least provide a tool to help identify what kind of growth we think there might be. This is planning level. This is not an investment grade, tool that you can go to the bank with literally. But again, we think that it at least generally serves the purpose that was intended. In terms of the alternatives that we looked at initially, there are basically 4 total. 2 technology options, BRT and light rail, and 2 different end-of-line options. We talked about this at the January meeting in terms of potentially operating buses between Brush Creek and Ruby Park, or Brush Creek and Galena Street, Galena and Main, a new station there, major station. So we looked at both of these different options for the end of line. We also looked at a 20-year planning horizon, so out to 2036. In terms of, go ahead, thanks. In terms of the components we looked at the existing ridership, 2016, latest numbers we've gotten from RAFTA, and it's a substantial number of riders, by the way, over 5 million transit trips in that year. We looked at the potential growth in ridership based on the regional population and employment changes between now and 2036, and trying to take into account, county plans, city plans, visions of what may happen here in terms of that growth, population and employment. We also looked at potential changes in ridership, albeit relatively small, in terms of the travel time of the different alternatives. If we can improve the travel time, for example, via the modified direct alignment, save a few minutes here and there, that is going to have a little bit of a positive impact on the ridership. So we considered that. Another thing we considered was the airport expansion. And there's a lot of interest in getting more trips to and from the airport via transit rather than automobiles. We considered that. Last but not least, we also thought about the entrance to Aspen traffic volume constraint, the idea of maintaining 1993 levels. What might we do in terms of additional service that would, again, encourage higher ridership? So those are the basic components that go into this spreadsheet model. In terms of travel time impacts, I already kind of spilled the beans, but in terms of that modified direct alignment, that could potentially produce a 2 to 3 minute time savings by making it easier for the buses to get in and out of town, not having to go through the S-curves, obviously. On the other side of that coin, though, is a penalty, a transfer penalty, as we call it, when we stop the buses on these 6 routes at Brush Creek, intercept them, have people get off the buses and get onto a different vehicle, for example, light rail. There's going to be a penalty there. It's going to take a little bit of time. That adds to the travel time. Anytime we add to travel time, it makes the transit option less attractive, and so ridership goes down a little bit. The bus to bus or bus to BRT transfer time, as you can see on the screen, we're estimating at about 3 minutes. And there's no additional wait time because we're talking about 10-minute headway in, 10-minute headway out. For the bus to light rail transfer, since we were talking about that minimum service level of 15-minute headway, there'd be an offset there. We'd have a 5-minute delay, for example. Somebody's coming up valley from Glenwood Springs. They get to Brush Creek, but they may have to wait 5 minutes for the next train that's going to head into Aspen. And we've got that same transfer time penalty. And in this case, we may be talking about, instead of just a cross-platform transfer, as we call it, one bus walk across a platform and get to another bus, we might even have to go to a totally separate platform, maybe slightly removed. We had shown you some different alignment options at Brush Creek. And the one that seemed the most viable had the light rail platform in a slightly different location than the current BRT station as you have it today. So we just added a little bit more time for that transfer. But again, it's a negative in terms of that ridership forecast. Go ahead. This just depicts that shows that same modified direct alignment as you saw earlier.
A question really quickly. Is there a plus, though, when the BRT would be able to override the traffic lights, and our BRT really can't do that now?
Well, actually, it can. It's
fully on all.
Well, no, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there's the opportunity to do that.
Okay.
It's called transit signal priority.
Okay.
And of course,
But at least right now, the buses don't get that priority at the ABC and things like that.
Well, they're getting some, are they not, at some of the signalized intersections?
We need to double check that with RAFTA.
Yeah, Dan, is there signal optimization up and down 82?
No.
Yes, there's
I thought-
intersections on 82.
Do you want in here?
Or so, Airport Business Center, Cemetery Lane, Buttermilk. So at least right now, I'm just saying that the rail, we would anticipate would not have the signal stops, and we at least right now don't have that for the buses.
Correct. Not as much as, again, potentially could be. That's correct. But you're right, that is a plus. Because if we can save, 30 seconds or something at every signalized intersection, that can add up to a lot of time.
Can
And
I just-
offset that transfer
the
penalty.
terminology, I appreciate there's lights that are for the buses only. That's one level of prioritization. Is there not another one where if the bus is coming and they have the ability to automatically trigger a green light as it's coming up so it never stops versus getting a priority? Is that what's in place, or is it the former?
You need to bring Dan up.
Maybe I'll stay up here.
Yeah, can't get to your microphone.
There is a difference for sure.
Multitask a little bit, I'm sorry.
The fire department, the fire trucks have this, right?
Yes.
What we have in place on 82 in the Mid Valley, say at the Willits intersection, we have bus lanes, XL and decel lanes, and we have the capability as we're approaching those intersections for us to get a green light. And it's in some cases it's an advanced queue. I think at River Road in Basalt and Highway 82 there, we can get an advanced queue as we come up. The other traffic is kind of held so we can get across the intersection in the bus lane and then get back into the travel lane without having to kind of dodge traffic. We don't have something that as we approach a signal, and there's no bus lane, we're just in a travel lane, it turns it green for that particular lane, or for both lanes of traffic. It's an advanced queue is what we have going for us.
So it's not like in the fire truck, you push the button, and changes, the signals at the intersection.
Okay. We got some of those by mistake initially, and then they told us we had to take them out. So.
Whoops.
There was a guy that had one in his car, Boulder, that guy.
All right, let's have Phil try to continue.
No problem at all.
Okay, thank you.
George,
By the way-
one quick question. The ridership number you gave us was 6,800 a day
On those 6
on
routes,
those 6 routes, and then it's 5 million per year
on the whole system.
on the whole system. So we're talking about different numbers for
Correct.
different things. Okay.
Back to your point about the terminology, just to be clear, what the emergency vehicles have is called transit signal preemption. So they absolutely get the right of way every time, and rightly so. They're emergency vehicles. Here we're talking about priority. So just as Dan said, you might get an advanced green to be able to get ahead of the queue of the traffic if you don't have dedicated lanes. Or you may have an extended green, so if the light's ready to turn red, but it detects a bus coming, and it will hold the green a little bit longer.
So there is some detection based on where the bus happens to physically be.
You know, and I think I may have misstated things. We're always in the bus lane when this is happening, but in essence, as we approach a signal, if it is green, it will hold it longer. If it's red and we're some distance back and it picks it up, it will turn it green so that we can get through it. Everybody can move through it. If we're in the bus lane at the intersection, then it will give us an advanced queue in a couple of locations so we can get through, and then the other traffic can start up afterwards. So there's a couple different ways that it works. But we only have, I think, 3 locations where we have signal priority, and they're all in the Mid-Valley.
Thank you.
And of course, that's always a balancing act, because you certainly want to optimize the bus operation or the transit operation, but not so much that you affect traffic terribly, and then you've got that congestion problem. So again, it's always a balancing act.
Thank you.
So what you see depicted here, these 3 columns, are the existing 2016 ridership, and this is system-wide. So back to your question a minute ago about the 5 million a year, it translates to about 17,600 trips per day. We think, based on all those components that we built into this spreadsheet model, that by 2036, that might grow to by about 4,400 more transit trips per day, so 21,300. We think that if we implemented BRT or light rail in the Brush Creek to Ruby Park corridor, it might go up yet, say, another 1,000 trips per day. And by the way, we discovered that with the time differences, the travel time differences between BRT and light rail being really pretty small, we think the ridership is going to end up being almost identical for either BRT or light rail solution. In other words, sometimes people will say, well, light rail's the answer. We'll have so much more ridership. Not necessarily. And the model is kind of demonstrating that as well. By the way, that growth translates to about another 1 million passengers per year. So it's a pretty significant number. The next part of this chart simply shows what the various components, how they contribute to this growth. As you can see, it's a little hard to see, but the 3,600 number, that growth in transit trips per day is purely based on the amount of growth in population and employment that's expected. So that represents about just under 80% of the total growth that we're expecting. The travel time savings adds another 200 trips per day. The recognizing the need to keep the traffic volumes at 1993 levels and encouraging higher transit use, that contributes another 800 trips or so per day. And then the airport expansion is a relatively small increase as well.
Bill,
Sure.
clarification.
Okay.
The population and employment growth, that's just on Highway 82 coming up, right, from Glenwood Springs?
Correct. Everything that would feed to this corridor.
Okay. And the population growth, is it based on what you pulled from planning commissions in Garfield County, or what you know is on the book?
It's a whole variety of
So
things.
some of the developments that are
Yes.
still being contemplated may be in here or may not be in here?
They are.
Okay.
It's the best guess today.
Okay, thank you. So the Sopris restaurant, the old Sopris restaurant, that development?
I
Think
can't
it's
answer
in-
that.
That's like 600 homes.
We were unable to pick out specific
Okay.
developments. So the population and employment growth that we took from the demographer and then updated for this study is intended to include those developments that are on the books, but they're not approved. The only addition that we really did beyond the population and employment was at the airport.
Thank you, Rob.
So that's the end of this segment.
It's a huge thing to consider. Ace Lanes project, Willits, all the Mid-Valley, Snowmass.
You don't have a microphone.
Okay.
So
and
that's
I
all
sh-
included. I just want to make a sort of a comment. When you first started, Phil, you talked about, you had a slide in terms of the transfer penalty. But, if we look at just the recent successful World Cup as an example, and we had the parking garage that was full for most of not all the days. The intercept lot was just about full. And so when we have when we have in place a very aggressive parking management plan that informs people that it's going to cost you X amount or you're not going to be able to park in town, but there are options via the intercept lot, the buttermilk, that we could capture a lot of people prior to coming into town through those actions. And every time we have a special event in town, we prove that, whether it be the X Games or just last week with the World Cup.
No, very good point. The nice thing about this spreadsheet tool that we created to forecast ridership is that we've now turned that over to RAFTA. And so they'll have the opportunity to play with it in a sense, and what would happen if we'd reduce that travel or the transfer penalty by a minute? What would that do in terms of the ridership? And what do we need to do to make that happen? That kind of thing. So there'll be an opportunity to
Mark,
play with
then
it.
Steve?
Yeah, I got to tease this out a little bit more. I heard, and perhaps I misunderstood, John, it doesn't count for, consider all the development that's going on in Snowmass Village
I'll let Ralph.
in terms of condos and.
Well,
what we
again, Marky,
anticipate.
other than the airport, we didn't pull out any specific developments, but those developments should be built into the population data that we
I'm not
worked
sure
out.
that they are. I mean, that's a question. We need to tease this out because where I'm going with this, we may be understated in terms of employment and population growth. That's where I'm going.
Well, I have a completely.
Steve was up and then
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Adam, go ahead. After you.
Adam, then Steve.
We had a discussion. First of all, there's this 20-year time thing, so we're already 1 year behind, and we haven't built anything yet. So I'm not sure if 20 years is the right traffic duration. Shouldn't that start with when there's some type of assumed completion of the system up and running, and then it's 20 years from there? Because by the time this gets implemented, if it does, I think it's minimally X amount of years away, 5 years away or something. Is that not the case?
We have to pick a planning horizon when we start these studies, Adam. We can't make a guess at what the phasing is going to be or anything like that. So it's normally done in the way we're doing it.
Which is you start with when you start talking about it, even though it might be 5 years to have the first person get on a bus or get on the train. Okay. So I think part of this assumption has 11,500 and some people living in the city of Aspen proper, not Meadowood, not Red Mountain, not Upper Valley. And I need to hit the BS buzzer on that because I'm not sure mathematically, and I've had these discussions prior. So I can go into it more, but the question is, if the population doesn't change nearly as much as the expectations, what's the big picture of light rail versus sticking with the existing system? And I don't have an extra grant at the moment. I'm just looking. But if it's all of us, so the state demographic people are sitting in Denver, and I agree, they don't know what's going on in Snowmass. They don't know what's going up in the Upper Valley, but they're also assuming trees grow to the sky. And I don't know where 11,000 people we need. That's 5,000 more people to live in basically no more homes in Aspen. So you have to have a doubling of the average population per household, or an epic, unprecedented, a resort community full-time boom of homes that are existingly second homes. They have to come from somewhere, and to me the math doesn't pass the first level of a smell test. Now, I'm not saying that anyone's cooking the books in Denver, but I think they don't understand what's going on here with them, with their own growth controls and building controls and land use codes and everything else. So we can get into the details later, but if the numbers are substantially less or substantially more, I'm assuming the result or your suggestion, professional opinion, at some point is going to be a lot different. So when should some of us that have concerns about the data going in raise their hand and say, hey, listen, we need to flush this out a little bit more?
Well, let me tackle that and turn it over to Phil. The data, the ridership tool can be used to account for disagreement amongst what population growth is in the next 20 years. That can be included in the model. We used assumptions that we made based on 2010 and 2014 demographics that had to be updated to 2016 and 2036. But those numbers can be looked at and adjusted within. There are a lot of ways to calculate that, and we're hearing both some views on high and some views on low. But Phil, I'd like you to talk about what difference does it make to the two systems?
Frankly, I'm sorry?
If any, I mean, maybe
we don't think it's going to make a lot of difference in terms of the demand or the attractiveness of one versus the other. And, you know, when we do these kinds of things, we're kind of giving you a few snapshots. The next part of this presentation is going to be about costs, both capital and O&M costs. Now, we've not taken our ridership and figured out, okay, well, what is the cost per passenger and how variable is that based on too low or too high a population forecast? We haven't done that yet, but we kind of do this one step at a time, as most of these are done. And so if we can kind of move to that discussion about costs, and then you can start to see, well, gee, what are the differences even between the cost of these two different options, BRT or light rail? That's, I think, going to enlighten quite a bit in terms of what you might think about it.
Okay, I'm happy to wait. Thank you.
And then
I think Steve said he'd acquiesce to me because I'm kind of on the same point as
Steve,
Adam.
you're such a nice guy
He
tonight.
is the best over here.
That's why you're sitting over there, not here. It's Rachel.
Thank you. Because these are kind of on the same line, and I'm just sitting there thinking, 20 years from now in this horizon, I'm going to be 76. So thank you very much. I'm pretty glad to have made it.
And still sitting here.
I'm still at the table. So that made me think about how hard it is for any of us to think about what the future is really going to be like. But I have the advantage of looking back 20 years or so when we first started long-range planning on the entrance to Aspen and on transit and mobility. So I've seen a lot of the pieces come together and a lot of the projections come together. So I'm not siding with 11,000 in the city of Aspen. It doesn't sound right to me either. But what I would say is I think the real difference is going to be the number of Aspenites who are working Aspenites versus how much commuting workforce you're going to have to bring up here. Because over that next 20 years, between me turning 56 and 76, an awful lot of remaining free market homes that long-term locals who work in the community live in are going to turn into second homes. They're going to be retiring. And so to me, it's not even as important of what is the population growth in Aspen, it's what is the job growth in Aspen and Snowmass and what type of commuting workforce we're going to demand in the future. That's going to be the numbers that drive a BRT system of anything coming up from below Brush Creek Village. We do know we have an awful lot of traffic among the triangle of Aspen, Snowmass, and Pitkin, so that'll make a difference. But so that's to me what really matters. And then secondly, we had a brief discussion on something the other day. I can't really remember what. Ralph was there at our BOCC meeting, and just the population numbers were a little off. They're working with 16,000 some odd in Pitkin County, and our planning office said, no, we think we have 17.3. So maybe it's only a 5% difference, but if that's a 5% difference in the end of the numbers later, I don't know how big that factor is. As I say, I think the workforce almost matters more than Pitkin County's population. So that's my main point is I think it's not just how many people live here, it's how many people will this community demand to drive up here, and how convenient will it be so that they take jobs here instead of taking jobs in Glenwood Springs.
More
Thank
residents, more workers, more tourists. Those are the three buckets of people.
You bet.
And the percentage of people riding the bus, and we're already at record participation, right? I mean, really good participation. The percentage of population on the bus. So I'm just wondering where all this extra stuff's coming from or where they're sleeping.
Good point.
I'm not adding enough, but.
And again, as I was saying, for this kind of a study, you really have to go through this exercise of, again, what's our best snapshot picture today of what that future is going to look like, and what does it translate to in terms of ridership and therefore increased service, obviously, to respond. I mean, the job that RAFTA has done, in my opinion, seeing systems all over the country, of responding to the growth as it's happened over the last 30, 35 years is unbelievable. And right on point. In other words, you've made Dan really do what he's done well. But it's a remarkable response to how that growth has happened. You can do that you can continue to do that. The idea is to try and get ahead of it a little bit and say, well, gee, what are we going to need in 5 years? Not next week. That's always advisable, but it's always a best estimate. It's because it's the best you can do. Nobody has that crystal ball, as you said, but we try to come up with tools that help define what is that future going to be, and then try to respond to it. Sure.
Thanks. Phil, earlier you mentioned cost. Don't worry about it. Snowmass is paying, so.
Well, I thought we were going to take up a collection or something.
No, I wanted to ask, can you make a summary statement that can bring some clarity to the variety of numbers you're talking about? Is this the slide that basically summarizes the
Sure.
type? Like assumption A leads us to option A or B. Option A equates to X, Y, and Z. Option B does. Is it possible if you do that now? Or
Only
not?
to a limited degree, because again, this is only one part of the equation. We have to think about the cost and what's cost effective and what's affordable, for that matter. But if I were to sum this up, I would say, given the tool that we have in place now, the forecasting tool, we think that you could see transit ridership growth of 1 million passengers per year between now and 2036. We can argue about where it's coming from, the composition of it, but we think that that's the kind of growth level you can expect.
Not per year. You mean at
No.
2036.
At 2036.
We'll have 1 million more riders.
It's a 20% increase over the ridership today, or in
Okay.
2016. So it's pretty substantial. But again, it's based on a whole lot of different factors.
Okay.
We think that the response to that has many different possibilities, one of which may be this intercepting of routes, the existing bus routes with BRT or light rail. That's one scenario. Another one we'd like to talk about near the end of this presentation is how you might phase toward that and things that could be done to, get you to that end point, but not necessarily by making a gigantic investment tomorrow, working your way toward it. In a sense, an incremental approach similar to what what RAFT has been doing for a long time.
Right. That's what we should take away from this. By 2036, we'll have 1 million more transit riders. The options we should consider are intercepting those riders with either bus or rail at some point in the corridor. And we should, there's some incrementalization.
Phasing.
Phasing what?
Phasing that service and getting to the point where you've got sufficient
Over time.
service for that
in
higher
3 years,
demand.
we should do X. In 6 years, we should do in 9 years. Okay. And phasing over the 20 years. Okay, good, thank you.
Steve, though, I think I didn't hear Phil say one thing, and I think you would ask the question, and I'm reading off of his notes, so I'll try to answer it. But ridership will not differentiate these alternatives, and I kind of heard you ask that question in a different way. So again, what we're saying here, based on the analysis that we're wrapping up before we get into costs, the ridership that we're seeing doesn't drive you into BRT or LRT specifically. Both of those systems will accommodate it. There's nothing here that comes out and says, oh, there's no way BRT can handle it, or, oh, you got way too much capacity for LRT. The ridership is not going to differentiate, is what our main point is here.
So what?
Well, cost will be a factor, certainly. I mean, it appears from the ridership analysis that we've done to date that both systems can handle it out in year 2036.
So what you're presenting is that we'll have these demand issues. There's another set of factors coming to help us, that'll lead us toward a decision, cost being.
Yeah, this decision is not going to differentiate systems based on ridership.
All right, good.
Bert, then Patty.
So on the ridership, you mentioned 6,800 riders earlier, right? And that's the upper, that's from the Intercept up to Aspen. And that,
on those 6 routes.
On the 6 routes, 6,800 riders. That's the only place we're really considering changing things. And so 6,800 riders times 365 days is 2.5 million, 2.4 million. And then at the same time, you're giving us a number of 1 million more off of a 5 million number for the entire system. And are we changing the entire system? When we put an alternative between the Brush Creek and Aspen, are we changing that other 2.5 million people who are on the system, who might ride from Snowmass to wherever? how does that impact that other 2.5 million people?
We've basically held that constant. In other words, we're leaving the other services alone, and we're saying just by the kind of growth in demand system-wide, plus the potential change in that corridor between Brush Creek and Ruby Park, that's where we're coming up with the 1 million additional riders per day, or per year.
Why are we talking about 1 million riders per year in a space that really is only 2.5 million per year? It's half of the 5 million numbers.
Correct.
What use this section?
Correct. So if we've got 2.5 million riders a year on these 6 routes,
Yeah.
we're saying that you're going to have 3 million. We're going to increase it by 20%.
From 2.5 to 3.
To 3.
Okay,
So
and
500,000 a year.
I think that's
half of
that's a
that
huge difference from what Steve just talked about as 1 million more riders. For the section that we're talking about 500,000 riders.
Correct.
Okay.
Half of the total increase.
Right, but the focus here is really from the intercept up. So
Sure.
I think whether more people ride it from the intercept to Glenwood, and we're not talking about light rail from intercept to Glenwood, I don't think, or intercept to Snowmass. So it seems like the focus would be a lot easier if the numbers stay consistent for
Sure, you bet.
the intercept to Aspen. That's where we're trying to have the conversation.
You bet.
Which is now 500,000.
Which is now 500,000 rather than 1
Yeah,
million.
but you really have to calculate, to me, the incremental increase coming from down valley in order to understand what you're working with.
That's what I heard.
Yeah,
That's what I heard
that's
Phil
exactly-
presenting.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's where, okay.
Patty?
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that the ridership doesn't really affect which mode they're using, whether it's light rail or improved BRT from the intercept lot. I think we need to keep in mind the concept we had about changing modes. How many riders may we lose who don't want to change modes, ride a bus to point A, get on a train to point B, get on a bus to point C? We may have some loss in ridership, and that goes to Rachel's point about then will we lose employees who say, great, they have a new light rail in Aspen, but it causes me to drive my car to a bus, take a bus to a train, and then take another bus in Aspen to get to where I want to go. And that in itself may cause us to lose ridership and people who want to work in the Upper Valley. I don't want us to not keep that in our thinking, because that's something that's been brought up over all the years is single mode, and that increases ridership. So I don't want to lose that thought.
You know, that's a very, very key point and good observation. But we have some evidence from other places where there may be a short-term dip, but then the ridership returns. And let me give you a real specific example. It must have been 8 or 9 years ago at least. The city of Denver was really concerned about all of RTD's buses coming in and out of downtown Denver, and there were a lot of them. Well, RTD was building their light rail system, and they built a major station at Broadway and I-25.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they did was to intercept a lot of buses at that location, not too different from your Brush Creek, and put the people on trains to get them, fewer trains to get them into downtown. So now they fixed the problem. They reduced the number of buses, and initially people said, well, I don't want that hassle. I don't have to transfer and wait and whatever. But it was a very short-term dip, and then that ridership came right back up, and it's grown ever since.
Well, that's good to know, but were those people carrying skis with small children and helmets and boots and ski poles and all the stuff that you have to take? If I was a mother taking my kids to Snowmass and I had to get from a bus to a train to another bus to get to Snowmass, I may just rent a car when I come to town and drive.
It's the same
Because-
point that you made
yeah.
at the last meeting, and I believe
So,
you, I
and we've
agree.
said that again, but, so I understand in Denver, if you're getting on a bus, going to a place, getting on the train, and then walking 2 blocks to your job, but that may not be as easy. We're a different community here.
Well,
I
believe
like
me.
comparing us to other communities, but many times we just don't compare.
Certainly, and I couldn't agree more. The other thing is that, and again, you didn't say it, but the fact is a one-seat ride is always preferred.
Yeah.
People don't want to transfer, ever, even one bus to another, if they, different streets.
I'd rather work at home.
Amen to that.
Well, or they'd rather work in Glenwood Springs, to Rachel's point of, are we going to lose people because we're not simplifying the system?
You bet.
We may, so we need to just not forget that point as we move forward.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Patty's concerns. They're very, need to be accounted for as we go forward. What struck me are 2 things from this last conversation. One is, what platform do we leave the community for growth after 2036. So that, again, maybe it's just a 2-paragraph narrative, but if you've chosen BRT and we're at that year 2036, what can they do with it from there? And if they've chosen light rail and we're at that point at 2036, what will we be leaving the choices of the future people for the next upgrade? Because traffic and population growth won't end at 2036. So that's one point. And then the other, it'd be a number that would be interesting to have, or a range, or however. But if we can look at the valley population, employment growth drivers, those factors, and then use them to say, okay, this is how much more transit ridership we can anticipate if we're able to maintain the same mode split, the goal that we'd like. I guess it breaks down into 2 questions. What will we have to do to get a bigger mode split and more people on transit and take that increase, farther than normal projections? But the other side of that coin would be to say, if we have that much increase in ridership, valley growth, everything like that, how many more cars will we have? And I don't think we've asked that question, because either one of these systems, as we implement it, if there's going to be, another 2,000 riders a day during those peak times, that current ratio is probably another 4,000 cars on the road. And so I think we need to look at that number as well to have context, because whether 300 of those new 4,000 cars are driving up to Snowmass and want to park somewhere, or whether they want to park in Aspen, or what, but that increase in congestion tends to drive transit ridership, because it's a much better way to deal with your commute. And so I think we need to have some sense of what would the growth of plain auto traffic be during that time period, even as we implement one of these 2 systems.
George?
Yeah, Tom.
I want to agree with Rachel, and it's on my notes too, Rachel, that, in regards to what's going to happen in 2036 to the commute and everything else, what's going to happen to the potential for everybody who wants to drive? There's going to be no parking. There's no parking right now. There's hardly any parking. We're having parking problems in Snowmass. So people are going to be forced into the transit situation. So you're right on, Rachel, and that's exactly what I was ready to say, that as growth happens, people are coming in. People aren't going to have the opportunity to drive into Aspen to work or Snowmass. There's no place to park.
Well, in fact, parking management is one of the best disincentives to driving and incentives to transit anywhere. Great point. Great point.
Steve.
Oh, thank you. I've got one question for Dan. I'm curious. I think the 1 million figure in 20 more years is probably low. How long did it take you to gain your last 1 million passengers? About what year was that?
Well, you could say, Dan, what was the increase when we went to BRT, right? Which has been it's instituted in the last 5 years.
I hesitate to give you an exact number. I could do it if I could get back to my office. I think that what we saw was that 2008 was our biggest year, because it was an epic snow year, and then gas prices went to $4 a gallon. 2009, we saw about a 25% reduction in our regional ridership, and it started gradually coming back. And then in 2013, actually 2014, our first full year of BRT operation, we saw, I'm going to want to say maybe a 600,000 passenger increase in a very short period of time. And that got us over where we were in 2008. It got us back up and over kind of where we were. So what is that? If 2008 to 2014 is about an 8-year period or something, where we gained somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 riders on the system.
Okay, thank you. And my other question or thought is, we're going to have self-driving cars in 20 years. It's going to be a widely accepted, probably everybody will have a self-driving car. We might have a smart highway. We might have a self-driving Uber service in Aspen. Different looks at what could be coming. Did you take any of that into account in like projections on how people are going to get around?
No.
No.
We didn't take that into account. The laws don't even allow for those vehicles right now. And there's a lot of different opinions, and I've got a different opinion than a lot. And I think that it's being oversold personally. I think that the legal and social and environmental challenges to self-driving vehicles are significant. I think that the fleet vehicles, buses and trucks, are going to come first, and you're going to hear a little bit about our ideas on autonomous buses soon. But I'm an old fart, and I don't always represent the most modern thinking, but I've been dealing with this for 42 years, and I see a lot of work being done on the technology side and very little work being done on the social, environmental, and legal side of this. But that's what happens when you let the scientists loose. They figure out a solution. Then the elected officials and the politicians have to figure out how to implement it. So,
any other questions before we go on to the next segment?
Right. Well, thank you all. We're going to move into the capital and O&M costs, but I'd just like to quickly set the table. First of all, I want to revisit the purpose of this Upper Valley Mobility Study, and that is to help feed into the Integrated Transportation Systems Plan. In other words, there's no decisions being asked for tonight. There's no checks that need to be written. There's no discussion about who's going to pay for what. What this whole study is driving towards is to give the EOTC an opportunity to advise RAFTA on what they need to input into their ITSP process. So I want to remind everybody that that's what we're working towards here. So let me jump into the opinion of probable LRT and BRT costs and kind of continue to set the table. We use the basic alignment plan that we presented to you at the October meeting. Some of you may remember it. We're working in 2016 dollars, so this is not the check that you write for the system. This is just a basis for comparison today. This is not a year of expenditure analysis. We're using current unit prices. We've pulled off CDOT data. We've pulled off data that we're experienced with here in the Valley. For the costs associated with the Marolt easement crossing and the cut and cover tunnel, that would be the new bridge at Castle Creek, the new cut and cover tunnel. We added a 20% escalation to the work that Parsons did in 2008, just to kind of keep comparing apples to apples. And then overall, we added a 30% contingency to the bottom line, which for the kind of estimating we're doing, we think is very appropriate at this point in time. So again, I needed to let you all know about the contingencies and how we attracted those. So I'm going to go through the LRT, and I'm going to try to simplify this. So we're actually looking at a total of 48 different cost variations. I don't think I'm going to present all of them tonight. But we're basically going down the list looking at two different options. One is a diesel electric LRT. The other is the electric with the onboard charging systems. Those are the ones that they don't require a wire. You just pull over the station and it charges. So those are the propulsion systems we're looking at. We're looking at either at-grade crossings at Brush Creek or grade-separated crossing. Those are some of the variations. We're looking at going across through Shale Bluffs at grade or in a viaduct. We're looking at a couple of airport station options. For the LRT, they both go into the station. And of course, at Ruby Park, we're looking at potential for either Ruby Park or Maine and Galena, which of course would require a new station at Galena. So this is kind of the way we've set this up. Now, the way we're presenting the costs is basically in either a base case, and it's like buying a car. The base case is the absolute basic minimum system. It will work very, very well. And then to get to the prime case, you start adding on your options, and that's how we'll be presenting them. But just for the base case, we're assuming a diesel electric LRT with at-grade crossings pretty much all along the system. That would take us under the roundabout. We did get some pretty good direction the last time. You may remember Commissioner Clapper especially was concerned. So that's the only place we're going with a grade separation. We are looking at an airport station with a moving walkway to the terminal under the base case. And of course, the base case requires a rehabilitation of the existing Castle Creek Bridge, because that's part of the deal because the city gets that bridge back if in case the new bridge gets built. The prime case is all the options, all the fancy options. It would include the electric overhead charging system power. It would onboard charging system. I'm glad you're still here, Phil. We've got grade separation at crossings at Brush Creek. We've got a viaduct at Shale Bluffs, underground airport station coming right into the terminal. again, going under the roundabout, following the Merald easement to Main and Galena. 7 stations again, we've been through those, and again, rehabilitating the Brush Creek Bridge. So those are the 2 cases I'm going to present next. So let me go through. I know this is a complicated slide, and I can see it better from the screen though. So the base case for the LRT came in at $428 million in today's dollars, and that includes all of the basics that I told you about. When you add in all the options, in other words, going to the onboard system, the grade separation, the viaduct, and so on and so forth, it jumps the system up to $527.8 million, a little over $500 million. And again, though, if you wanted to just pick a base case, but you wanted onboard charging, you would add $30 million to the base case. Sorry, I should pause for a moment of silence, perhaps.
So we can catch our breath and our hearts start beating again.
How much was it in 2000 or 95 when John?
The last estimate we saw was in the record of decision reevaluation was $150 million in 2007, I think it was.
So it's 5 times. In 10 years, it's gone up 5 times.
Approximately, but Steve, I gotta say that the consultants that did that estimate did a good job. They didn't estimate this system. Their system ended at the airport, was my recollection. It did not go to Brush Creek. So it's not quite fair to compare apples to oranges in that case. Right. This is a much more robust system, I would say. It also didn't include these onboard charging systems either. But again, just so you know how to build this up, you can take your base case and then come in and add in any option you want. But when you add in all the options and you go for the prime, that's where you run up to the $527.8 million. Our system here is about 6 miles long, I think, isn't it, Phil? 6 miles long. So we're a tick under 100 million in a mile. The range of LRTs across the country are 50 to 100 million a mile. So I think that passes that smell test. So let me keep going into LRT O&M costs. Again, we went in and looked at costs from a lot of different systems around the U.S. They do vary widely, but the average cost we came up with is about $275 bucks an hour in 2016 dollars. So what that comes up to overall for the LRT is about $6 million a year. But there would be some cost savings from bus reductions. We haven't included those in this. So again, it wouldn't give us an apples to apples comparison otherwise. So let me move on to BRT. Again, we're looking at a multitude of cost variations there. The choice here on the propulsion side is either CNG, which is what we've got now, or the electric onboard charging system, and we presented those technologies in October. We've got the buses either running on State Highway 82 or on new dedicated bus lanes, and that relates particularly across the Merald easement. We're looking at terminating the current system at Ruby Park, or as an option going to the Main and Galena, which of course there's nothing there, so that requires some improvements. We're also looking at operator controlled, which is what we've got now. We are thinking an autonomous control is going to be a possible option by the year 2036. And one point I want to make about BRT that is a little bit different than LRT, it's very difficult to phase a rail system. You kind of got to build it from point A to point B. You've got to put the stations in. You've got to buy the rolling stock. And that's another distinguisher between BRT and LRT. BRT can be phased much more readily than LRT. But let me get into the numbers there next. See if we need a moment of silence here. But why did that slide not? I guess I didn't hit it hard enough. There we go. So the base case for the BRT with the CNG buses is about $160 million. But I want to mention to everybody, a large portion of that base case cost is the preferred alternative alignment across the Merald easement. Our current estimates on that are running close to $100 million. And again, we had estimated it back in 2008. I think it was around 60 million. So that number is what we've escalated to. We think that's a very good number, but keep that in mind as we go through. And again, the base case there would be the CNG buses with an operator on grade to the roundabout, going across some rolled easement, using all the existing bus stops, but they would be upgraded. The only new stop would be at 7th and Main to support the new alignment, and a line at Ruby Park. And of course, the existing bridge would be rehabilitated as we went across the rolled easement. There we go. So the prime case, which is about 200 million, which is about an additional 40 million, would get you the electric buses with the onboard charging. We did consider autonomous buses. We've also considered dedicated bus lanes, and we've not put a full-scale number to that yet because there's still a question in our minds about getting around shale bluffs. The cross-section at Shale Bluffs currently does not allow a third lane. We're making an assumption, which may not in 10 years be a good assumption, that an autonomous bus would need to be running in its own lane like we have from the airport into town. That's an assumption we're making today, but that's why you're seeing us not putting a cost of widening at Shale Bluffs, because if the autonomous technology allowed the bus to run in mixed traffic from Brush Creek to the airport, you would only need to do some signing, striping, and some precision mapping. So that's still a little bit of a question. But again, when we're talking about emerging technologies, we're trying to give you folks, I know how experimental you people like to think sometimes. We wanted to provide that. So again, that's the range of costs for the BRT. The bus, yes, sir.
You said that the bus is 160 to 200, but I think I heard you say 100 million, regardless of fancy buses or not, I appreciate that, is the realignment. So can we assume if realignment doesn't become part of the discussion, it's 60 to 100, or is there some cross? I'm assuming there's not any cross cost there.
No, there shouldn't be.
Okay.
It may complicate the situation at 7th and Main, though. We were scoped to evaluate based on the record of decision. So it's a fair question, Adam, and I would suggest that 7th and Main is going to look different. It's going to look a lot different than it would with a preferred alternative if we had to put a station in there. So you raise a good point. I hadn't really thought about it.
We're spending like $5 million to change it next week, so right? Didn't we?
Yes.
So,
yeah. Anyways, okay.
But let me move into the.
Started digging yet? Maybe we should stop. Okay.
That's 1% of what we need.
I know.
Let me move into the bus O&M costs. And by the way, the preferred going across from roll easement isn't getting any cheaper. The EIS, the record of decision, costed it out at about 40 million. We took it, I think, in 2008 up to about 60 million now. Again, this is just based on construction cost escalation.
Ralph, one last point on that question. It was because in the past there was different pots for car funding versus transit funding. Is that number just for the transit component of going across the road, or would that include the realigned travel lanes for general traffic?
The real money is in the grading and the structures, which would be the cut and cover tunnel, piling up the dirt to make the landfill work and create the open space.
Bridge.
And the bridge. The Castle Creek Bridge is expensive top-down construction to preserve the environment and protect the neighborhoods. So I would, I mean, you do get 2 lanes of pavement for cars to drive on, and you also get the 2 lanes for the BRT. In the case of the LRT estimate, you don't get the 2 lanes for the buses. It's just the 2 lanes for the cars and then the rail.
No, it just was in the past that it was like, well, CDOT, when they had the money, would pay for the highway component, and that would be X, and then locally we'd have to pay for the transit component, and that'd be Y. So I'm just asking, is the cost of the preferred alignment that you've put in here including general highway costs, or is this just the transit component costs?
The highway costs are included. What it is literally it's about
2 lanes, but
it's 2 lanes, a quarter mile long.
But it still would become something I think the board would want to look at as to how much of that cost is being allocated to transit when it obviously is a highway realignment as well. And so I don't think it's fair to say all 100 million or whatever it is to go across the rural is all transit.
Well, and that's our next step, is to identify possible revenue sources. After we get some feedback today, that's what we're going to be going to next, is the possible revenue sources.
Thank you.
Very good question. I'm glad that this does get confusing because you still have to build the bridges and the tunnel and the bridge and the tunnel and so on. But anyway, in terms of bus O&M costs, it varies widely across the U.S. Again, as always, we discover the average is 137. Raft is under that average. Phil, I'm at a loss here. Which number did we use? We used 120. We used the rafted number. Thank you. So what that comes to is about $3.2 million a year for the BRT for the Upper Valley mobility area. And but again, there would be some cost savings from the bus service reductions. So just a quick comparison so you can see all this kind of complicated stuff on one slide. The base cost for the LRT is $428 million. BRT is $159 million. The capital cost with Prime at the LRT is up at $527.8 million, about $200 million at the BRT for the Prime case, and you can see there how the comparison goes for the O&M.
Well,
yes, ma'am.
Quick question. So everything the accommodating the increased ridership with BRT, is that only possible with the cut and cover Meralt alignment, or could you possibly do that with the existing alignment, or is that a whole nother study?
That would be another study. The issue there is travel time. It's not a big study. I mean, the fact is that, as Phil had showed you earlier, you're gaining 2 to 3 minutes of travel time by getting the buses out of mixed traffic into a continuation of the Highway 82 bus lane that terminates below the roundabout and then picks up again at peak hour. And by the way, we are assuming a bus lane on either side of Main Street. So you've already got the bus lane in the outbound direction. On the inbound direction, we are assuming you'd give up the parking and have a continuous bus lane to a new station at Galena. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. So that's another part of the BRT, that solution that we're analyzing.
So the biggest difference in those two alternatives is the travel time.
The travel time is a big difference, and I'm sure that there's safety. We weren't charged to study safety, but I understand back when I was working at CDOT, there's significantly high accident rates at the S curve. So it would be safety and travel time, but we're not analyzing safety at this point. Can I move ahead then, and we're going to a summary comparison?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I wasn't.
You're saying $100 million gets the community a savings of 2 to 3 minutes of travel time?
On the buses.
For the buses?
For the buses, yes.
And for cars.
The cars is the car travel time savings, and I'm really rewinding now. In 2008, one of the components of the study that we did was to look at the travel time savings to the cars, and because the cars are still running in a congested condition, it was my recollection between 7th and Main and the roundabout, it was more like a 30-second savings, something like that, because the cars were already in congestion, but that's per car, so that adds up eventually in terms of cost of congestion and so on. And it reminds me of a question. Some of you are members of the Institute Forum. A few weeks ago, we had some really smart planners from Fair and Piers, and I think Mr. Sarpa said, I wouldn't guess the community is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a transportation improvement. And the young man, a sharp planner from this other consultant, said, you're already spending hundreds of millions of dollars on transportation in congestion, lost time, and environmental impact. So I want to keep this in perspective because these are big numbers. So let me just run through a quick summary comparison here. The LRT and the BRT ridership is virtually the same. There's not much difference there. The LRT would reduce the number of buses at Ruby Park and improve air noise quality more than the current BRT. Again, that would be because it's an electric bus. It's an electric train. The LRT capital cost is more than double the BRT capital cost. The LRT O&M cost is double. The bus service plan refinements that Phil talked about could help reduce the number of buses and improve efficiency through higher passenger loads. The electric buses would improve air and noise quality at Ruby Park. So again, the electric buses do give you many of the same benefits of the light rail in terms of noise. However, one thing I want to point out, and again, I live on a rafter route. Every bus that comes into Aspen goes by my house, and every bus that leaves Aspen goes by my house. So like the lady who we got some very good testimony from earlier, I live with the rafter system in my front yard, the smell, the noise. We're talking here about noise, and we're talking about diesel fumes in some cases, or CNG. It burns a little cleaner. But to me, what one of the real issues is the scale. Look, when you've got a bus or a light rail system running in a residential neighborhood, it's like a house driving down the street. And when we started this, I know that Mayor Skadron was concerned about the noise, and he was concerned about the pollution. But I'm just going to suggest there's a third issue here, and that's one of scale. And it's just something to think about that I've come to.
Point number 2, and I'm sure this was in a previous slide, but you say it reduces the number of buses. What percentage or
mass and scale
is the reduction?
Again, it would depend on that service level that we establish. And in fact, it may not reduce the number of buses a whole lot, because if we're trying to maintain that high level of service that everyone's become used to and that we want to maintain in order to discourage automobile traffic.
And a lot more people.
I'm sorry?
And 1 million more people.
Yes.
Yeah. So not significant then. Okay.
And the last point I wanted to make after the electric buses point is phased BRT improvements can still set the stage for future LRT. There's nothing here that precludes a system. Rachel, I see you nodding your head. You remember from the record of decision. Even your ROD, the record of decision is very unique. It's the first record of decision in Colorado that allows for phasing, which is what you've done to date with the replacement of the Maroon Creek Bridge, the addition of the dedicated bus lanes. The old bridge is there ready for LRT at some point. So I feel a little uncomfortable giving all these big cost numbers without giving you some idea that there can be phasing in the BRT, and you can build that BRT up to someday maybe you'd have the financing and the political will to replace it with an LRT. So I want to try to see some smiley faces a little bit, I think, here, rather than a lot of frowns.
I like the custom light rail myself.
Well, again, Parsons worked hard on these cost estimates, and we're as an organization very comfortable with them at this point.
Thanks, Ralph. Steve had your hand up.
Another question for Dan. Out of the O&M cost for the bus system today, how much of that is labor of the drivers on the buses? And if we're doing autonomous buses from the Brush Creek into town, would they have an employee on there, or would they be going driverless?
Well, you want to take the first part of the question, Dan? I can if you can't, so.
Well, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70% of the O&M costs is related to labor.
And that's standard throughout the industry.
Mm-hmm. But at the moment, if you try to run an autonomous bus or an autonomous truck, some of you might have read they ran a Budweiser truck, and that truck had to have a driver in it, and that's still the law. It has to have a driver. Mm-hmm. And that's why when I get on my soapbox and talk about how the laws have to catch up with these technologies, there's talk in the legislature now about certain conditions allowing vehicles without a driver, and I still predict that it'll be buses and fleet vehicles like trucks that first get on the road and into traffic.
Well, I realize that right now they have to have a driver on there.
Have to have a driver, even if they're self-driving.
Eventually, the technology might get to the point you don't need a driver.
Well, I suspect
but we maybe still would have a driver because there's always a human factor that we might always need to have an employee on the bus or the whatever vehicle to answer questions and all the different things.
Well, Commissioner Child, that's good thinking, but then again you think, well, let's think about security. Well, there's cameras. There could be security personnel undercover that ride the buses. That might not be an issue. You need information. Well, again, we're talking about high-tech solutions here. I don't know why you need to put somebody on the bus to talk about information when there's a way to push a button in your seat and have a video screen come up and tell you what's going on in Aspen this week, if that's where you're headed. So again, I'm excited about these technologies, and I don't want to give you the idea that because I'm not hot on autonomous cars, these are great technologies, and by 2036, I believe there's going to be autonomous buses running up and down this valley.
Mm-hmm. Greg.
Yeah, hi, Ralph. I wanted to agree with Ralph. Yesterday, just an anecdotal thing. I went to the bus stop on Main Street, waited, and and missed the one I was trying to get on. But there was really a bus train. There were at least 4 or 5 more buses almost immediately behind it. It was truly a convoy of buses, and I managed to catch the last one. But as you're saying, noise is a factor. But just, I think what people complain about in Aspen is just these convoys, because it seems as if there's a continuous convoy. So we're not talking about 1,000,000 or 1,000 buses. We're talking about the number of riders and the number of trips. And already, just to point out, you've got a great point there. The second thing I wanted to ask you is, I'm just having trouble being new to this scenario. Can you describe or explain to me a little more clearly how we're going to save 2 or 3 minutes on the crossing the Meralt?
Well, I guess just pretend you're on a bus and you're in the current situation. You come through the roundabout and then you stop. If you're in a congested realm, you come through the roundabout and you start heading towards Cemetery Lane. And in a congested day, you stop and you get into what the highway engineers call level of service F, which is stop and go traffic. Then you're in that all the way until you get around the S curves, which have no capacity. We can't calculate what the capacity of the S curves are because the design speed is below 20 miles an hour. So if you think about then with the completion of the preferred alternative, the bus is going to go through the roundabout and have its own lane all the way to 7th and Main. That's why intuitively, it's hard to think about that unless you walk that alignment and realize, well, I would have a complete open lane for the bus. That's why the buses get a 2 to 3 minute advantage, and the cars only get a 20 to 30 second because they're still in a congested condition. But it's better because they're getting platooned out from 7th and Main on the new traffic signal that would go in.
But there'll be a traffic signal at 7th and Main, so there'll be a stop there.
Yeah, there would be a traffic signal there, but the analysis we did back in the EIS days indicated that would be beneficial to platoon traffic. You can always move more traffic through a system if you can platoon it, which we're unable to do with the current system. It's nice to have some new blood, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, that's dangerous though, because I have a lot of questions on ground you've already covered. So I'll keep it brief.
Other questions?
George, General, Bert?
I guess not only the platooning needs to be kept in mind, but also the, you mentioned the $4 a gallon gas changed the ridership. The cost to operate electric vehicles at 12 cents a kilowatt is probably a third of what our current gas prices are now. So as people transition to private vehicles that can, or shared individual vehicles that can operate per mile at a third the cost of the current gas prices, rather than twice the cost of the current gas prices, that may change the whole dynamic.
I think the 12 cent a kilowatt hour is the straight cost of power. And if you're comparing that to a gallon of gasoline, that gallon of gasoline has got taxes added into it too. Not a lot, not enough in my opinion, but.
Yeah, one of them is tax-free but that's the current cost.
You're right, it may mean more congestion and
So-
higher parking prices to control the auto congestion.
And our parking prices are as high as they can be right now. We have raised it, I think Mitch has, so there's 90% full. And anything increased above that, we may lose money. And so, but it gives you a lot of money. You can spend $1,000 a year on parking with the amount you save on gas using an electric vehicle coming into Aspen right now. So,
Should I continue, Mr. Chairman?
Oh, I thought you were done.
Well, I was just taking questions. So.
Oh, okay. No.
Well, I just wanted to go into next steps. The next steps that we're going to do based on any direction we get tonight would be to either refine or eliminate options. I'm not hearing much of that tonight. We will be doing some ridership analysis. I think we heard a few things that Phil's going to want to probably go back and test. We'll put we're preparing the UVMS report, and we are going to get into funding and talk about revenue streams and things that can possibly help. Of course, the one we know of is your State Highway 82 use tax revenue stream. That's a start, and you've got money set aside. And then we would just start looking at other options such as federal, state, or additional local funding to move this thing ahead. We are talking about a public open house in Aspen after this meeting. We're struggling. April's usually not a good time to have those meetings, and we're looking at maybe doing that in May. And we would have one public meeting up here to wrap this up, so to speak, and basically not do a lot of new information, present all this information, because it's not really been, there's not been a public meeting other than these EOTC meetings so far. So, you know, I've got more time for questions or discussion, but I wanted to just offer a BRT phasing consideration here, and I might ask Phil to help me with it, but these are just some ideas we came up with, again, to take the sting out of some pretty high price tags. I mean, I work on billion-dollar projects, and that's not unusual, but again, you know, I worked on Snowmass Canyon, and that was $250 million to get from basalt basically to buttermilk, including Snowmass Canyon. But there are options to phase, and you know, one of the options would be, as Phil's talked about already, just going ahead and starting to optimize the service plan that he had talked about before. That'll give some savings perhaps. It could be either reinvested into the bus system or used for something else. Another option would be to go in and buy electric buses initially for just the Buttermilk and Snowmass Village routes, starting to get to the noise and smell issue. That's roughly $900,000 million each for those buses. Again, adding the buses down for the BRT and the Valley routes, again, $1.3 million each. We're not telling you how many buses to buy, but again, these are attainable numbers. Continue then working with RAFTA to replace the existing buses with electric buses. Again, that's going to be beneficial to the community. And Phil, you just jump in here if you want to add something.
Well, where's the 9 million coming? I mean, aren't the can you break that down when you talk about bioelectric buses for Buttermilk and Snowmass Village? I thought the buses were 800,000 each in that range.
Right. It does vary depending on the size of the vehicle and the amount of charging equipment to go with it.
So what is that, 9 million or
It's
0.9?
It's 0.9. Sorry, it's 900,000 roughly.
Oh, okay. I thought you said 9 million.
I'm sorry. If I did, I misspoke.
Upgraded stereo.
And then, of course, you know, as you move down the ladder, if you can come up with $102.6 million, again, as Rachel suggested, there might be a CDOT component to that. And then the potential for continuous bus lanes from Brush Creek to Buttermilk. We have to evaluate the cost to widen around Shale Bluffs. And then last but not least, retrofitting buses to autonomous control. That would be an expensive bus, a much more expensive bus, but again, there would be some savings. So I just wanted to present this. This is kind of the phasing that we're going to be looking towards to present you further down. We're unable to provide something similar for the LRT because, again, a train doesn't lend itself to phasing like you can with the buses.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I don't look at this quite as much as a phasing plan as you've presented it here. A lot of it has to do with upgrading equipment. You know, let's just upgrade the equipment. That's not a phasing plan for an implementation of something to me. Now, the other components are, but what I'd love to see a little more of is the upgrading of the stations that may be part of upgrading BRT. I mean,
Want a bigger egg? What do you want?
no.
More dinosaur
I like
eggs.
eggs. But I guess you know what I'm saying is that we're not including, say, Galena in here. If Galena is going to be a potential depot for
That's correct. Galena is not
BRT.
part of this list.
And so, to me, the options about this is the better equipment you can buy as you need it. Yeah, sure. But a phasing plan for implementing something that then becomes a really good platform for people to grow off of again in 2036 is more about physical capital guns than butter. And buses are butter. They run out. They have to be replaced every 10, 12 years. So
Good point.
that's just a small comment on that. And then the other, I just would like to make sure everyone is aware of the table is that our fearless transit leader, Dan Blankenship, was down at the State House yesterday to testify on the potential statewide ballot question this November. It has leadership support that's bipartisan, and it has come out of the first committee and has moved over to the Finance Committee. For those who haven't been following it, it would be a 0.63 statewide sales tax. They're moving away from gasoline tax, and they're also working on the potential bonding measure that would go with this. And right now, there's really nothing for the Roaring Fork Valley in that $3.5 billion bonding measure. We've been so slow to be able to decide our solution that we haven't been able to get it into the transportation planning region. And, you know, I don't know if CDOT will have a next money, if that measure passes, to do large projects like this on the side with allocated funding, or will we have missed the big capital push for the next 20 years? The big issue right now that we all should keep in mind if you're talking to your state reps or anything is the component of that sales tax that would be dedicated to mass transit and transit in the state. And right now it's roughly about 30%, but there's a big push by any number of rural counties and front range communities or highway only people to say it should be a much smaller share. And I think that it's really important that as we have moved from gas tax, a very direct user pay for the miles you drive type of method, to a general sales tax, a lot of people will be paying that sales tax who only ride a bike or who take the bus to town and then eat lunch out and pay sales tax. And so our push really needs to be to not reduce that transit component of that funding measure, because that's what we're going to need to tap into to implement any of these programs in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. So what I'm hearing from our past discussions and sitting in on RAFTA and the Institute's discussions is a couple concerns, certainly from the city of Aspen, concerns of limiting the number of buses that are continuing to come in. But I'm starting to get a sense that a lot of that concern is due to noise and pollution. And by going to electric, we can address those two issues that would, I think, help lessen the concern by the residents in Aspen. The other issue I'm seeing is the opportunity for a system that could be phased in, BRT versus the rail, and certainly the cost. The cost for an LRT, for a light rail system, for a relatively small community, relatively small population, even if we project population in the valley going up to 50, 60,000 people, doesn't really make economic sense versus an ongoing BRT. The question, though, I think for this group, this committee to consider is the political will to address the congestion that is ongoing, that won't be resolved unless we actually install a new platform coming into town. The S-curves will never get any better. The congestion will continue. It's going to amount, as Ralph said, even though the cost for that platform may be about $100 million, we're already paying that in economic and social and environmental costs. And that, of course, can be phased in depending on, not phased in, but we have time to develop a funding mechanism to do that. So that's part of a phasing program. So for me, what I'm really thinking about now is looking towards, as we're starting to replace our buses, going to electric to address the noise and pollution, and start looking at funding mechanisms to start to create a new platform to get away from the S-curves, which is, as we've seen, it's not going to improve at all. It's just going to continue to get worse. Dan?
Oh, you're done?
I'm done.
Okay. And just to add on that, then I think we need a more in-depth discussion. When you talk about the increase in ridership, increase in bus trips, how much will a new station at Galena Plaza alleviate that? You know, would you be splitting the buses in half? I mean, more of a discussion about that, because I think that addresses some of the noise and congestion problems. If we have half the buses going down, then and have some type of transit route that you talked about, or some way to get across town, whether you're still in the S-curves or doing an alternative alignment in town, will we still need that second station?
Go ahead. Well, the second station was an idea of Parsons. It wasn't included in the original record of decision, as I recall, although I think I recall some discussions, but that was almost 25 years ago now. But yeah, the Galena station is included in the estimates. I didn't show in the phasing plan because that phasing plan doesn't include everything. That was just kind of a snapshot of what you can do kind of to get things going. But yeah, the Galena Street station, we did make an estimate on that.
Right, and just to hear more about how that is benefiting the system.
Well, the major benefit would be to keep the transit vehicles that look like houses when they're rolling down the road on the spine route and not have them running through neighborhoods. That's
not just light rail, but also the BRT.
Also the BRT. And then the Ruby Park station could be adapted to more of the local and express buses perhaps, or maybe just use smaller vehicles. And I use the analogy, any of you that have been down in Carbondale and seen what Raft has done with a circulator and gone from I think it was a 40-foot bus, wasn't it, Dan? Down to what I was informed is a chassis and a body, which is a box truck with instead of a box, a place to sit down comfortably in. So that might be an option. Then you could go with lighter, smaller, quieter, more appropriate scale vehicles that are running down Durant and Monarch and so on. That's kind of what we were envisioning.
And looking at 60-foot articulated electric buses that they could just stay down on the bigger size, or the over-the-road coaches, they stay on Main Street and get the smaller buses out.
And just one other comment on the, all the preliminary work that you did and presented tonight. I know there are questions about the population projections and where in the valley it's happening, and is Aspen emptying out or filling up, and those are important. But I appreciate that it, using the data you had, the point was to get to what's the distinction between LRT and BRT. And as I understand it, the conclusion is, in terms of increasing ridership, increasing the level of service, there's really not that great a distinction.
Correct.
The biggest distinction is the cost, right?
As always. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Phil, I'm sorry, I owed this group an explanation of an equivalent or LRT system, and you had talked to me about a system in Norfolk.
Oh, the next largest community with light rail is Norfolk, Virginia. It's a relatively new system. It was started in 2011, I want to say. It's about a 7-mile line, and again, they paid upwards of almost $100 million a mile, pretty close to that. But their population is on the order of 2.5 million people. So, totally different scale.
At that traffic talk the other night, he mentioned this new system in Oakland from the airport to
Airbart?
To BART.
Airbart.
Which they...
It's a people mover.
Yeah, which they paid quite a bit for, but they didn't have the density population is not...
That's 120 million a mile. It's an elevated system, and it's very expensive. Works great, but it's expensive.
Patty?
I just want to tag on to the Galena station. Mm-hmm. Would we have to condemn or purchase the property there to make an appropriate, adequately sized bus station? So we would be probably eliminating the Shell gas station, which would mean we would have no gas stations in town? Can I just point that out?
Well, certainly. We're, Patty, when we're looking at a 20-year planning horizon, we made certain assumptions on that. And yeah, you're right. I mean, that's where the footprint would go. And
because
and
we have the church there, which we can't really condemn, and we have the historic courthouse, and then we have the view plane issues, which the city has been very careful to protect, going down to Galena to the parking garage to the Rio Grande Park. So the only corner we could really work with would be that corner, where the cost of condemning or purchasing whatever mechanism we chose, that property added into the cost of the
We did include the cost of the Galena Street station, but we assumed that Mayor Scattern would get the Pitkin County to give up the courthouse as an option. So.
Actually, you have to talk to the state about that. We just pay for it. The state really manages it.
But yeah, in analyzing all of this, the 7th and Main station requires additional right-of-way.
Right.
The Galena potential station at Galena requires right-of-way, and there's a small amount of private right-of-way that's still necessary for the preferred alternative that's outside the Meroldt easement on the Aspen side of Castle Creek, and those were all considered.
And when you're talking 7th and Main, it would just depend on which side of 7th, whether it be the east side or the west side, because you've got a church on one side there, and you've got a house that's been up for sale for years, and then you've got some development, and then you got affordable housing.
We were on the side opposite I'm trying to think of a landmark, the side opposite of the Christian Science reading
Right,
room.
so it'd be on
Yeah.
the west side of
West
7th
side,
Street.
yeah.
Okay.
That's where we're laid
Yeah.
out.
All right, we got about 5 minutes left on
Thank
this. Greg?
Just a quick one. If we go BRT, we're going to be looking at more wheels on the highways. And I'm wondering, when do we start talking about what's going to need to be done to Brush Creek Road and what's going to need to be done to highways to accommodate more traffic? Are we going to, is widening Brush Creek or strengthening it part of the discussion? I happen to live on it, and I'm afraid to go on Brush Creek already sometimes with the traffic I see on it. That's the first question. The second one is probably a curveball, and I'm because I'm new, I can ask it. And why can't we have the big buses stop somewhere around Pepka Park or elsewhere on Main Street and not run all the way to Galena? Can people walk an extra block or two and save us a lot of congestion problems?
Well, to answer your first question, we didn't analyze anything on Brush Creek Road. I know Snowmass Village is concerned about the conditions on Brush Creek Road, but that's outside of our study. As far as where the end of the line is, you could put it wherever you wanted. I hear people all the time say, "Oh yeah, I don't mind riding a block," and then walking an extra block, and then I see them driving their car a block and parking it. So it's hard to say. I mean, when I was working on the EIS up here as a CDOT official, I was frankly appalled at the lengths of the small automobile trips that occur up here. And I think that actually nationally, a lot of automobile trips in our communities end up being short trips that can be replaced by active transportation, that being bikes or on foot.
Adam, quickly.
You want to solve one of the biggest, I appreciate you always having me on the clock, George, but if you want to solve one of the biggest issues of all time in Aspen, maybe a couple extra minutes wouldn't hurt us.
If we can get it solved in a couple minutes, I'd be happy to give you that.
I offered you a year ago $1 billion in King for the Day and come up with any solution that solves the traffic problem in Aspen, and I offer that to anyone else out there, and I'm still waiting. One of the problems that I've seen happen sitting up here for a couple years is that ideas that never have a chance of ever happening continue on because of inertia and keep on going on and on and on. So one temperature check I'm trying to figure out is, even if light rail was no more expensive than the BRT, is there still support for it, that it's part of the Upper Valley vibe of having a train and all that goes along with it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we all need to think about. I think Bert a while back said he didn't want to pay for the study because I think what you were hinting at is that either you didn't want to even get into the train, or even if you did, you didn't think it was ever going to happen no matter what. So that's something that I'm taking away to try to figure out where the $500 million is coming from. But even if there is $500 million, is that really it for it? So I just want to make sure that we start to think about that to all of us sitting up here in the community as well. I think, so my question to you, Ralph, along that is, and it's my interpretation, is that, are you making a recommendation already now? And I appreciate you're here offering us unbiased advice, but I'm continuing to hear that from staging and cost and everything else, that we should really be looking towards an enhanced BRT system over light rail.
Well, Parsons is not the decision maker here, but we're not going to get out of here alive unless we make a recommendation. And I think the recommendation that supports BRT is a potential to phase it and not have to come up with a large amount of money in the first place. And when we started building Basalt to Buttermilk, we didn't know where the $250 million was going to come from. But as political will and plans get produced, money seems to find the project.
Okay, and then when you and George say, and maybe it's different definitions, when you say political will, is it that there needs to be a better, more guts sitting at the table, whether it's us or someone else, or is it the population of the community that needs to do something? I'm always confused about and maybe I'm a little overly sensitive to, about political will, about not being able to stick a neck out as an elected official, make a call for the long haul, or is it mostly just about the population, community trying to come together, some level of consensus at some point to make a big decision.
Well, I think that's part of it, but I think it has to start from the elected officials in terms of taking the leadership, in terms of coming up with consensus that we all agree with, and then being advocates for that and pushing for that. And ultimately, if there's a question of utilizing the Merle property, we know how many votes have been taken. Again, it comes down to the leadership of the elected officials to push that political issue forward. I mean, that's what I think.
I mean, that's fine. And I said, I have no philosophical issues going across Merle. I do have an issue about spending $100 million to save 2 minutes, point blank. And Steve and I have had this discussion. I think Steve has more sympathy for the current S-curve, which is fine. I'm less sympathetic for all the issues about time and traffic and congestion and environmental stuff. But I'm lost on the 2 minutes for $100 million, digging up a bunch of open space, da-da-da-da-da. And so that's just a further discussion as we leave BRT versus LRT and get into more of an entrance to Aspen discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, for what it's worth, that is 2 minutes for every bus trip in and out, every day.
Yeah, but that's every single most people are only on the bus twice a day, maybe 4 times a day.
Uh-huh.
So what I'm saying is that every rider is going to save 2 minutes.
It's 500 million minutes a year.
Yeah.
And again, looking at the success of the dedicated bus lane, when you're sitting in a car in traffic and you see a bus go by, you go, I would have been there by now. And that extra 2 minutes going across the preferred alternative alignment across the easement across the open space will probably have a positive effect on your transit ridership. It's clearly going to have a positive effect on clearing Main Street at the end of the day and things like that, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Can I just real quick, wait a minute. If we do the straight shot, it's 2 lanes of traffic unless you have light rail, right? The platform is only, I thought you can do a dedicated bus lane?
Yes, ma'am.
We can't.
There would have to be a public vote.
We'd have to take it back to the voters.
A 4-lane unrestricted is not part of the deal on this record of decision.
Political will.
Yeah. Rachel?
Thank you. Sorry, I just need a clarification there. We're talking like it was a given.
You know, I think we're all kind of giving a little bit of our thoughts about what we've heard so far, even though there'll be further wrap up. And I appreciate Adam's comment that it's worth a little more time. I think that you have to realize that throughout the process, there's always tipping points. There's going to be a tipping point when Aspen can't charge $6 an hour and not put people off of the town and get horrible for parking. There's tipping points about how bad that congestion gets. You know, it may be 2 minutes now, but some days that's an average. Some days it's going to be 4 minutes, and some days it's going to be 10 minutes, and some days it's going to be less. And that tipping point will either push people, you know, to take a job somewhere else or tell their boss, I need another $1 an hour because I'm losing 5 hours a week in my commute. It adds up, and I don't want to sound at this table that I'm unsympathetic to the cost to people's work life when they're coming up from El Jebel and trying to get home and see their kids. Because leaving the entrance to Aspen is not their only congestion hurdle to get home to be with their families. They're going to run into other hurdles, and this is just the last straw. It's almost like people saying, you know, the airport has to be great because it's their first and last impression of the town. Well, the entrance to Aspen is, and then further down. But, you know, I just want to talk a little about the politics for a half second, because I've seen this go both ways. And I've had the political will to put the Merle on the property, on the ballot, and it may have cost me the mayorship. But what you have is some people right in the middle. And if you propose a bus solution, they will be running ads that, hey, this community deserves better. It should be light rail, you know. And then if you propose a light rail solution, the ads will say the exact opposite, that light rail is too expensive. You should just improve the BRT. And they will swing that vote one way or the other to be a no vote on any solution. So that's why I think there's been a need to look at what light rail could do for our community and what the cost could be. So you can tell people that's why we're not doing light rail now. You know, but I think it's also important that this phasing be presented in such a way to say we're not foreclosing those opportunities. And many of these infrastructure components can be dual purpose and used for that implementation as it goes forward. But we've swung back and forth with that middle vote and they always can align a certain amount of pure four-laners on either side to hate buses and hate light rail, to not do it. But that's what George is talking about, I think, when it comes to political will, is being willing to put things on the ballot again and then campaign for them. And I understand any hesitancy, and I understand that this group has tried to build consensus for quite a while with a number of toolboxes. And there's eventually going to become a point in time whether there's a majority of residents who are living over on the other side of the Castle Creek Bridge, or loss of residents in town, or people just tired of the hassle and they will accept a different alternative. But I don't know if we've reached that point. And the last thing I'll say is that still comes back to me before I would, quote, kill rail or say we don't need to study it anymore, is that concept of what is the platform that we leave for other people to improve on in the year 2036. If it's like, oh, well, now we got to add another 50 buses a day and it's even worse. Well, that's one thing. But I can accept, I'll be the first to say, I can accept the answer of just increasing and improving BRT in the short term, whether it's ameliorating the negative impacts, as George has said, with the electric buses. But we still have to keep a long-term vision on this. It won't go away. The problem will not go away, and it never will go away. You can just relieve it somewhat. You can give people different systems to get in and out of town efficiently. That's where I feel about the political will. But I think you'll hit certain tipping points that it's not going to straight line no matter what. People are going to get either so frustrated that town's going to get a bad reputation for visitation, workforce doesn't come here. There will be tipping points that will affect this dynamic.
Thanks. So Ralph, you'll be back in June. What will that look like?
Well, we've got a series of questions that came up tonight that I think we'll plan on addressing in June. But beyond that, the additional work is going to be, as I mentioned in the next steps, and I probably ought to go back there. Whoops, went too far. The next steps being all these refinements that we're talking about, and also we do need to gather some information for we do want to do the public open house and bring the results of that outreach back to this board also.
All right, great. And so again, that's why I think it's going to be really beneficial for the EOTC to be meeting probably between the June and the October, because there's a lot of time we're going to need for discussion to come up with hopefully some sort of direction that we can.
And again, I want to reemphasize that what's important to the RAFTA process is that some direction be given to the ITSP so that as we move into this next stage, which is analyze alternatives, we've got some guidance from the Upper Valley communities in terms of what to include in the ITSP to look at stage 3 and then ultimately the stage 4, which is the financing options.
Yeah, great.
Could I also ask a question, and that is to get your guidance in terms of this public meeting? Because in the same way that a ballot item will bring out both sides and you can swing it any way you like, it seems to me that the public meeting has to be crafted carefully so that if everything's on the table, fine, we present it that way and then see what the response is. But if this group has some notion back to that idea of leadership to suggest, well, we've narrowed it maybe a little bit. And this is what we'd like to hear feedback from the public. Coming right back to your comment earlier. Here's what we think. Let's hear what our constituents think. So there are different ways to approach it. I'm just curious to see what you think.
When do you anticipate having this public meeting again?
We're talking, and I don't think April's going to work, George. I think realistically it'll be May.
Yeah.
I'm not sure May's
So I think we have time to get back to. Perhaps we could all be working independently through our managers, and then bring that back to maybe to John Kruger to come up with, rather than trying to address this right now.
Yeah. No, that would be great. Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but we'd love to get some feedback.
I would appreciate that. We have regularly scheduled technical advisory committee meetings that involve John Kruger, David Peckler, and Brian Pettit, or GR, depending on who's available. And we could pull that feedback back. I appreciate Phil letting you know. We would like to have that some guidance before we start preparing displays and things. The material is all there, I think, for the most part.
Right. All right, great. Well, thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
Let's see. We're going to move on to our last agenda item, which is A discussion of Snowmass Village connections to the bus rapid transit service.
Thank you, electeds, and we'll be short and sweet because we know you want to get out of here.
Microphone.
You have to turn the mic on.
Thank you, electeds. We'll be short and sweet because we know you want to get out of here. The memo we think is pretty self-explanatory on page 15. What we're requesting is that during the hours of operation of BRT service in the Roaring Fork Valley, we would like to have a 15-minute interval considered for connections, regional connections to Snowmass Village. That's pretty straightforward. We're studying with RAFTA at this moment, Snowmass Village running that service in the spring and the fall, and we think we can give you a 25% reduction on the cost of that service to the regional agency or whoever's funding it through the way we would try and schedule that. This is just to let you know that we're talking about this now because the wheels of bureaucracy move slow. In 2018, you're going to spend $4 million on the improvements to the Brush Creek Park and Ride to boost it as an intercept parking lot. We would like to have some kind of benefit out of that improvement and help our parking struggles as well. And we see that a 15-minute service interval, though not as good as the success you will get that we've found in our park and ride program at our rodeo lot, or that Aspen's been enjoying since BRT has gone to 7 to 10 minute service and the utilization of the existing intercept lot. We think at least 15-minute service will help us with that. Just want to point out a couple of things for you in the packet, why I made the attachments that I did. On page 17, the small pie chart in the top right-hand corner of the information from the travel pattern study by Charlier and Associates that was just completed by RAFTA with assistance from the EOTC funding. This is the regional service utilization of the various transit modes. You can see that regionally, 42% are using BRT service. Other service is roughly 40%, and both services are 18%. So VRT is a successful service plan, and we're pretty, we would like to take advantage of that for Snowmass Village as well. The problem for us in spring, summer, and fall, there's only half-hour service headways from Intercept Lot to and from Snowmass Village, and so BRT frequency doesn't really account to much benefit to Snowmass regional passengers. If you go to page 18, if it doesn't buy us any good graces with commuter movement and business investments, the small commuting data of residents graph that is there on the center lower right, you got to go to page 8, there you go. Of Snowmass's residents, 46% are workers in Aspen. So we're a pretty big bed base for Aspen's workforce, and we would like to improve their experience in using transit as well, and taking advantage of the BRT service. Lastly, in the profile of Snowmass, the same little pie chart exists in the top right-hand corner of your packet material. Utilization by Snowmass of Velocity RAFTA, it's 13%. I will make one observation. I didn't bring the attachment, but in Aspen's profile, and Aspen roughly has only 8% or 14% of its residents working outside of Aspen. Aspen has a 27% utilization of BRT service. So Snowmass is in need of something to try and incentivize utilization of that service plan to make it more attractive to Snowmass regional passengers. Obviously, the rest of the statistics are there. Most of the people, 77%, are probably on local routes with on RAFTA service or possibly local shuttle service. So, in a nutshell, we're looking to try and get an increase in regional connections from Snowmass Village to BRT for commuters, workers, residents, guests. We think it'd be an immense enhancement to the system as it exists today. And we're looking to try and probably have that implemented with the completion of the Intercept parking lot somewhere for the winter of 18-19. And to get that done, we probably got to start talking to everybody. We would like your support before we go to RAFTA and talk to them or the board directly. Once we have some preliminary cost analysis done, we would like the support of your representatives to help us with this request.
Thanks, Dave. It's great that you're doing this study, and RAFTA is certainly the place to have that discussion. And I know that Marky knows at least that RAFTA is going to be looking at actually changing the BRT frequencies now that we've already made our federal 3-year commitment in terms of having to run so many buses on a set schedule. So RAFTA is going to be looking at demand management as well, and perhaps seeing less frequency on the BRT during the quieter times of the day that we saw earlier today. So that may become a factor as well. If the BRT is not running as frequently at midday, then that may reflect on additional service up in Snowmass. So that's a discussion that we need to have.
One thing we do want to make sure, and appreciate that, George, and appreciate the staff, we have to continue to remember that Snowmass is continuing to grow, and it's growing exponentially. And many of the worker bees do come into Aspen. We do realize that. But I can tell you I'm a victim of lack of transportation surface. Waiting a half hour at BRT when you got to go all the way down to Glenwood Springs. Back to your comment. I've gotten to the point I just have to drive. I don't have time to sit at the Intercept lot for a half hour. So, and going to work and coming home.
I'm not opposed to this marketing principle. I think it's an appropriate discussion for us to move forward.
Thank you, Steve.
So you're coming back,
Adam?
You're studying some costs, and then is this a worker and or visitor thing or both, or what's the main? I'm hearing a lot of worker issues, but is it also from a tourism standpoint, or is it mostly a workforce issue that you're looking at?
We look at it a little bit as both, but remember, BRT service is targeting the commuter movements. So and we structured it in our memo that we're trying to tie these service improvements to that frequency on the Highway 82 corridor. So its main target probably is workers, but it's possible that in the afternoon going into Aspen, there could be great benefit for the guest service between Aspen and Snowmass.
So if it is worker-based with others, then it's a spring and fall, not just a summer issue. This is for full-time residents moving back and forth efficiently in the bus system.
And guests.
Spring, fall, summer, it's going to capture guests as well. And we're attempting to try and expand our tourist season going into September and start it as early in June as we can. And so, we're trying to build on that as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the work.
Bert, then Rachel?
Was this the cell phone data that was used, so we actually know who was workers and who wasn't workers and who was guests and who wasn't guests?
No, this was a Charlere's study done in 2014, but the cell phone data was kind of beta tested against some of it, and it seemed to corroborate it, so.
Okay, because it seems like we purchased data that should tell us who's a guest, who's not a guest, who's going where, from where, who spends the night in Snowmass, who is doing what. So that data's all there, and
It's only on buses.
It's only on buses, right?
That's the problem.
It's not on buses. Is it only on buses?
It's all buses.
It's all
phone data. It's everything.
All phones.
It's all phones.
The raw data is all
everything.
phones.
It's all
What
phones.
is being studied is the transit
Wait.
portion.
Let's one person who can answer that question. Instead of a lot of Dan, can
That's
you
you.
answer that question?
You're the guy answering it. That's you.
David had the right answer.
Okay.
I just looked over at you.
Is this David or that?
Yeah. The answer is that the raw data is there for all the phones. What you have paid for is to capture that data and then have it massaged for the transit aspect for this Upper Valley mobility study. To understand the other components of movement, or to make it a true travel pattern study, would require some significant additional investment. Well, investment to get the analysis.
But we've purchased all the data. We should know who's flowing between these points and what the demand is and what the
if you remember what Ralph said, there's some 3 million bits in this data set, and it's just a stream assigned in some ways randomly, if in some ways by day is organized or something. So it's not as simple as that sounds.
For what the data that was collected, the cell phone data and being used now, it's not a travel pattern study, which is what you're looking for. That's a different study. You could use the same data and then analyze it differently, but that's not what's coming forward in the ITSP, which is a transit study, and the Upper Valley Mobility Study, which is transit oriented also. You'll not get a travel pattern vehicle type study out of that. That's a separate, different scope of work in a different study.
Okay. And then the load factors for the route we just heard were for the whole valley was like 33%, and for this that you're suggesting increasing is what?
Well, what we said was 42% of the valley commuters are using Velociraptor.
13%.
So we're at something like 13%. So we're trying to boost that somewhere similar to the 27% that is being seen out of Aspen, given that our movement is significantly commuter-based, if not guest-based, and Aspen's movement is pretty much internal, except for about 12 to 14%.
But load factor is seat capacity and ridership. So are you short on seat capacity and ridership, or are we increasing frequency to try to increase? And where is that? Is that at 33% now?
That in the peak hour can be at capacity, and so this service is trying to target peak hour. I would say somewhere in the 60% range would be what we would be targeting on our service. Remember, I operate a smaller vehicle, so in spring and fall it gets a little more, the parameters are a little more confined. So I think, yeah, we're looking for high efficiency. We're not just doing it for grins. We're also looking that it will boost utilization.
We have more commuters than Aspen, we believe. You've got twice the demand that we've got, or twice the use than we have. So we think if apples are apples, we can double our use of BRT today, at least, if that level of service is provided. And that's what we're looking at now, what those costs are. And we wanted to get you guys.
I'm willing to have the conversation. I just would like to have more data.
And tonight, we just wanted to give you the heads up. The discussions are going on. We're starting this. We knew we need to come back several times with you. We just wanted to get the discussions right.
As I said, I support this in principle.
Rachel,
I'm sorry.
Rachel, then Steve afterwards.
Yeah. I also support going forward with the study. I think that that's real important, and I apologize. I was out to use the restroom if I missed some of your earlier presentation. The commuting workforce needs is going to be a number that's most important to me to know. How many workers in Snowmass live in Snowmass, and how much of your job demand is for workers outside of Snowmass? That is just a critical component of future needs. What I'd like to say is I know that in many ways Snowmass has been stymied of its own participation in the halfpenny because the construction and the base village and these potential sales tax generating things have been delayed for a decade or more, and so it's made it hard to say, we have the money to do this. I do think it's important that if this is coming back to the halfpenny, it's going to take a lot harder look at the funding. The biggest fear of those who worked to create the halfpenny originally was that over time it would slowly all become operating and there'd be nothing left for capital for bonding. and for those sort of infrastructure improvements. And I know I've heard Markey and others on the Snowmass Council talk in the past about, we no longer call it the lockbox, but your savings account for capital of, wow, we need to redo the rodeo lot, we need to do this, and that you have capital needs, and then the city has capital needs. And so I would be concerned about that, but it's always a matter of magnitude and what the gain is and how, I think this is going to be, in many ways, with the right data, an ask of RAFTA. And there's a potential with RAFTA going to a potential ballot question for more mill levy support in the future, that this research will be critical to having that included in the new service plan. But I'd imagine that if RAFTA is going to something, and we all have reps on the RAFTA board, that this is very timely to be able to plug it in there appropriately, and that maybe there's some contribution here. But I support the work going forward, and I have no questions there.
Steve, the other Steve?
Yeah, one of the issues that is happening here is the BRT buses don't meet other schedules. They're on their own schedule, and I've seen times when a BRT will pull out of the Intercept parking lot heading down Valley, and then a couple minutes later, here comes the bus down from Snowmass Village. And if it's Markey needing to go to Glenwood Springs on that bus, you just missed it because the schedule. Now, a lot of that could be probably addressed by adjusting the BRT schedules to leave a little bit, to leave the Intercept lot a little bit after the Snowmass bus is supposed to be there, which they're not. Sometimes they're delayed getting down there. But I totally agree with the issues that are involved and the problems. I've experienced it personally a lot of times. One of the worst waits you can do is if you're working on a weekend and you miss the once an hour bus and you're in Snowmass Village and you have to wait an hour till the next one. And that's happened to me a few times. And that's a real strong incentive to take your car the next time when that happens. So having more frequent bus service, more year-round is, I think, very critical for workers.
Ann?
Yeah, I support moving forward, more discussion, but as Rachel said, more data on the commuters that would be using it. And as we were talking about, BRT is primarily a commuter system, and once an hour or once every half hour is not really useful for commuters. So I'd support the discussion of talking about more frequency, but just let's see the data, and you've got a lot here, but if there's any more research you can do to back that up, that's great.
Mm-hmm. From this side of the table?
I agree.
Well said.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So last on the agenda is updates and future agenda items. Any updates we have from staff or from the
We like that.
EOTC? Rachel, I know, has already mentioned the proposed tax initiative. I've got some materials here that I'll hand out as those who want to follow it. Let's see.
Do you want me to?
Thanks, John.
One at a time.
Yeah, just on that point, while we're handing those out, I think it'd be very helpful for the mayors of the communities to either call their state reps and let them know that they're in support of this measure, and particularly that the transportation component is critical and shouldn't be reduced. But this train has kind of already left the station. I don't know if it'll end up getting killed at the state legislature before it actually gets out, but it seems to be moving forward pretty heavily.
Just a comment on that, Rachel. Needless to say, Snowmass has a very high sales tax, and another 0.6 on top of that's going to probably give us the highest in the entire state. So we within Snowmass are already talking about how we're going to deal with this.
Yeah.
The other thing too, could we ask Parsons to send those slides to all of us?
I can, I'll resend the PowerPoint to everybody.
I didn't get it. I didn't get it.
Not the power, no, you didn't.
That's what we need is
Yep.
Yeah, just so you know, Marky, I've argued at every forum I could that this should be a gas tax, not a, and it's
I
just
totally
not
agree.
going anywhere.
Nope, it's not.
Okay, anything else? With that, I will adjourn our session. Thank you very
Thank
much.
Thank you all.
Sorry I was late, but make sure I'm on the attendance there. 'Cause I raced back from.
Marker card.